Can I have your attention, please? Good morning. I'm Nancy Hawes. I'm the director of the Houston Center of the Asia Society, and I'm honored to welcome all of you here to this conference and to Houston, Texas. It's a tribute both to the importance of the topic that we're going to be discussing for the next 2 days, as well, I think, and we think, as the importance of Houston as a growing international center. Many of you have come from outside of Houston, and we hope that you'll have a really special time while you're here. You should know today is Go Texas Day, so if you see everybody in Western attire, that's what it's all about. You're welcome to go put your rodeo clothes on if you want. If there's anything that I can do for you or any of us, please feel free to ask us. We would ask that you keep your badges on at all times. We do have some security concerns, and we want to be sure that we know that the right people are in the room. If you parked and did not get parked here at the hotel and did not get validated, there is a stamp outside which will reduce your charges for parking. I'll be around and I'll be back, so if anybody has any questions, please let me know. And now I'd like to introduce Nicholas Platt, President of the Asia Society, who's going to give the welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Nancy. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to China, the United States, and Asia, Challenges for U.S. Policy and Business. A lot of you have traveled a long way to come here and talk about this subject. And it's a testimony to the importance of the subject, and it's a testimony to you. I'm very impressed with the number of people on our speakers roster who have been participating at the World Economic Forum talks in Davos. There are a large number who are simply shifting their deliberations to Houston, Texas. This is no wonder. Houston has become one of the major international centers in our country, and it has major trade with Asia. It has a major Asian American population, and of course now it has the Baker Center, which under the able leadership of Ed Zarigian is going to reach out nationwide and internationally with the message that Houston is at the center of things. We're only too delighted to be doing this conference with Ed and the Baker Center, and we feel that at the Asia Society that the real message and the real work of the institution teaching Americans about Asia is in the heart of America. And so we're very pleased that we can be here working with you and discussing topics of major importance. I'm very grateful to Nancy, who you all know, and who has been at the very heart of the planning here, to Charles Foster, who is the chairman of our advisory board, for their hard work in making this conference possible. Mike Lampton of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and Bob Kapp of the U.S.-China Business Council have provided us with invaluable assistance as cooperating organizations. Obviously, a conference like this wouldn't be possible without the support of our corporate underwriters. All of them are listed on the conference folder. All of them deserve our profound gratitude. As historians look back on the 20th century, late 20th century, there's no question but that China's awakening as an economic power will be recognized as one of the most important events of the era. The Asia Society, we've always felt that understanding China is extremely important to the American people. We also feel that the relationship between China and the United States will be one of the keys to a stable and prosperous 21st century. All of us know that the growing market in China brings with it extraordinary pressures on the Chinese and concerns amongst the neighbors and trading partners. all of us realize that the closer a relationship gets, the more you rub. And therefore, the frictions that we have been experiencing in our relationships with China are evidence not simply of disagreement, but also of increasing closeness. China is growing at a rate that worries people. Every time an international unit or a unit of any kind that is that big grows that fast, people in the neighborhood get concerned. So, we're here to talk about this. We're here to try and figure out ways that we can make this relationship work. We want to explore the challenges and the opportunities ahead for China and the United States. And we want to do that together with American corporate leaders, because in the post-Cold War era, it's the big direct investors and service providers who are the engines of engagement. They are the people who are putting their money on the line, their people out in the countries where they are investing and working, and they're at the forefront of engagement, of our engagement with China. So, that's why we're here, and I'm really looking forward to all of the interaction and the discussion. Thank you for coming, and welcome.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this conference on behalf of the James Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. This event is, as Nick indicated, our first joint effort between the Baker Institute and the Asia Society. And I'd like to take this opportunity at the very beginning of our conference to thank not only Nick, an old colleague, as I said last night, not old chronologically, but old in terms of our collaboration and diplomatic service together, but to thank him and all the members of the Asia Society who have worked so hard in developing what I am convinced is going to be a most informative program on this key issue. We're particularly pleased by the caliber of our participants, American, Chinese, and others. Over the course of the next 2 days, we will be privileged to hear experts from the fields of government, academia, journalism, and business. We will hear disagreements, I'm sure, but we can, I believe, be confident that they will be informed and informative ones. I think I know I speak for everybody here when I say how much we are looking forward to our deliberations, and I think the attendance at this conference is witness to that. The subject of the conference, China, the United States, and Asia, is not just vitally important, but extraordinarily timely. Anyone reading the major newspapers and magazines and television coverage in the last weeks will see how China and U.S.-Chinese relations are getting extensive coverage. The relationship between Washington and Beijing, for better or for worse, will surely be one of the most decisive factors shaping the future of East Asia. And as anyone who has looked at our media will know that that relationship is passing through yet another period of intense strain. And indeed, some would say crisis. But as you, who are Chinese experts, know, the word for crisis in Chinese is composed of 2 Chinese characters, danger and opportunity. Today and tomorrow, we hope to gain some understanding of the origins of the strains besetting the U.S.-Chinese relationship, some comprehension of their ramifications for both countries and for East Asia, and most importantly of all, some consensus about ways that the United States and China, working together, can find opportunity, namely common ground, to overcome the differences that divide us and to advance our shared interests in stability and prosperity in East Asia. For the United States, those interests are simply vast. They run the full gamut of political, security, economic, and human rights issues, and they are often divergent and often seemingly contradictory, and they transcend traditional government-to-government diplomacy. Indeed, the U.S.-Chinese relationship has become so complex, especially in the commercial field, that it is simply impossible to hold a conference of this sort without the energetic participation of the private sector, as Nick underlined. This is why business issues hold such an important place in our program and why we are pleased at the participation of so many corporate leaders from around the country. Many are from Houston, which is symptomatic, I believe, not just of the importance of the dynamic Chinese market to the U.S. economy, but of the emergence of Houston as a truly global business center. I also wish to note that the Baker Institute will be including in its basic research and program agenda a special focus on Asia, and we are delighted to begin this effort with the Asia Society. We have a busy schedule ahead of us. I know we're all eager to see it begin, so I would now like to turn the floor over to Chase Untermeyer, the Director of Public Affairs of Compaq Computer Corporation and a member of the Asia Society Advisory Board, who will introduce our first speaker this morning. Thank you very much.
He is known and revered in this town and in many others. So I won't presume to go over his extraordinary record. I will tell you, though, that from the point of view of a hard-bitten former government professional who rate their bosses by how well they make their institutions work, he is widely admired. We admired Secretary Baker for the way he made the White House work when he was Chief of Staff, 1981 to 85, by the way he made the Treasury work when he was the Secretary of the Treasury from 85 to 1988, and by the way he took charge of American foreign policy as Secretary of State from 1989 to 1992. Politics, parties, and policies aside, it is my private and strongly held view that none of these institutions have worked as well since he left. From our cooperation with Ed Jurigian at the new Baker Institute, I can tell you that the new Baker Institution is working very well, too. This is the Asia Society's second opportunity to hear Secretary Baker's overview of U.S. policy towards Asia. We remembered and were honored that in 1989, he was the first Secretary of State to use our platform in New York for a significant statement on American policy towards Asia. It received wide attention throughout the region. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to our platform. We can't wait to hear your thoughts, and we're delighted to know that you're willing to take some questions. Please join me in welcoming Secretary James Baker.
Thank you very much, Nick, for a very, in fact, overly generous introduction. Minister Soon, Ambassador Lee, distinguished guests and visitors from all over, we're delighted to see all of you here and to have you here in Houston. Nick lied pretty well when he said that I was known and revered in Houston and in many other places. I used to be fairly well known. I used to walk through airports and people would come up and say, "Hello, Secretary Baker," or "Hello, I know you, you're Jim Baker." It doesn't happen. It happens every now and then, even today, but not quite as often as it used to. Although Susan and I were in Bangkok last fall, walking down the street, and someone came up to me, as people used to do all the time, and they said, "I know you." He said, "I know you." I know you. He said, aren't you Jim Baker? And I puffed up with pride and I said, yes, I'm Jim Baker. And he said, well, where's Tammy Faye? How quickly they forget. I seriously want to offer all of you a special welcome on behalf of the Baker Institute. We're very proud to be able to co-sponsor this conference with the Asia Society, and I must say, looking out across this room, I now can understand why everybody came up to me at the reception and said it's been a very, very successful and special day. And I'm really pleased to see so many members of the business community from Houston particularly here today. From the very inception of the planning of this conference, we focused our efforts on developing a program that would be of interest not just to policymakers and scholars, but also to businessmen. And of course, our reason for doing that is simple, and that is that it is simply impossible to speak of China, or indeed of East Asia generally, without reference to the vast commercial ramifications of economic developments in the world's most dynamic region. Our program and your presence here tonight, I think, bear witness to that, and we are very, very grateful for your attendance. Tonight, what I'd like to do is to share my own personal views on American policy toward East Asia. I was telling somebody earlier after the press conference here before dinner, it's really nice to be out because you can have these personal views and you can express them. And you don't make too many people too mad, but the main thing is you don't get into a lot of trouble for not following the party line. Let me say that my perspective, I suppose not surprisingly, reflects my experience as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of State. But my perspective, I think, or at least I hope, is also grounded in an appreciation of the importance of East Asia to the United States, as well as of the vast changes that are sweeping that region of the world. And I'd like to talk about those changes as they relate to America's relations with the other three major Asian powers: Russia, China, and Japan. And by focusing on these three countries, I don't want to in any way give short shrift to to the other nations of this region, because many of those rank among the world's star economic performers. And of course, they exert great collective influence, particularly through regional organizations like ASEAN and APEC. Still, I think it's clear that relations among the United States, Russia, Japan, and China are going to decisively shape developments in East Asia. Let me start with Russia, a country that we all too often, I think, neglect when we start talking about developments in East Asia. Because despite its domestic difficulties and military decline, I think we should recognize and admit that Russia remains an important regional force along the Pacific Rim. And I know I don't need to tell anybody in this audience that developments in Russia over recent months have been very, very unsettling. And I'm referring, when I say that, of course, to the Yeltsin government's swing to the right, following the very strong showing of nationalists and communists in last December's parliamentary polls. The peremptory dismissal of the remaining reformers or liberals in Yeltsin's cabinet, combined with the obviously more aggressive stance toward Chechen insurgents, I think reflect a distinct and in some ways alarming shift in Russian policy, and one that raises very clearly, I think, the specter of a Russian return to its authoritarian and even perhaps its imperialist past. Nevertheless, I think it's really important for the United States and for our allies in East Asia not to overreact to these developments in Russia. I think we ought to remember that a successful Chechen bid for independence would really wreak havoc with the territorial integrity of Russia, which after all is a multinational state of 21 autonomous regions. In particular, it would strengthen movements within Siberia which seek greater political autonomy, or for that matter, even outright secession from Moscow. And needless to say, such a fracture would only increase, not decrease, tensions in East Asia. The disintegration of the Russian Federation is very definitely not in our interest, nor, I would add, that of the countries of the Asia-Pacific region generally. And I think we ought to also be wary of drawing too ominous a set of conclusions from the results of those last parliamentary elections. The victories for communists and nationalists clearly indicate a growing dissatisfaction among the Russian public, not just with the Yeltsin government, but also with the economic hardships and the social dislocations that are associated with reform. Recent reports of far-reaching corruption in all areas of Russia, particularly in the privatization of state enterprises, has only intensified this dissatisfaction. But I think, nevertheless, it is important that we remember that the likelihood of a return to a Soviet-style command economy approaches zero. Liberalization has, after all, led to the creation of a vast entrepreneurial class with a strong vested interest in the free market. And so far, at least, Russia is continuing to go forward with its IMF-sanctioned program of macroeconomic stabilization. I think that absolutely key to what happens in Russia, and key as well, therefore, to our response to events there, is the question of whether President Yeltsin will now abandon that specific program and thereby abandon a broadly reform-centered approach. Whatever their faults, I think both President Yeltsin and the members of the new parliament are, and we need to remember this, after all, the freely elected representatives of the Russian people, and that in and of itself is a circumstance simply unimaginable just a decade ago, and it's one which becomes more entrenched with each election. One thing I think is clear: we need to be prepared at a minimum for several years of occasionally fairly uneasy U.S.-Russian relations, as Russia grapples anxiously with the vast domestic and foreign policy challenges that are now confronting it. Economically, I think as long as Russia continues to pursue macroeconomic stabilization, the calls that we hear today for a cutoff in Russian aid are premature. Politically, suggestions that NATO somehow be refashioned into an explicitly anti-Russian alliance are not only foolish, but dangerous to the achievement of our overall policy goal of peace and stability in Eurasia. After all, the best way to make an enemy is to look for one. So let me turn now to Japan. Like Russia, if less dramatically, Japan too is passing through a period of profound economic and political transition. The recent economic slump and financial crisis clearly signal the extent to which Japan's traditional approach to growth, one that has been grounded in aggressive export promotion and in protection of its domestic market, is really no longer a viable approach. As I have said before, something I couldn't say when I was Secretary of State, but I can as a private citizen, for Japan, I think the mercantilist chickens have come home to roost. A shift to a more balanced economy, marked by higher levels of domestic consumption, is clearly in order, not just to deal with the significant structural imbalances that have been built up by virtue of Japan running these year after year constant trade surpluses of over $100 billion with the rest of the world, but also to deal with the problems Japan is now experiencing in her own economy. More and more Japanese, I think, among elites and the common citizenry alike, are recognizing this need for a more balanced approach to economic growth. Japan is also moving through a period, I think, of political transition. The selection of Hashimoto as Prime Minister reflects, I think, at least in part, a desire for stronger leadership, for more innovative political leadership, if that is possible. And I think it is possible. It is a trend which I believe we here in the United States and Japan's other friends should support. The entrenched power of the bureaucracy in Japan has long been a major impediment to reform in both domestic policy and in foreign policy. And only strong political leadership can help move Japan from the policies of the past to policies that can help her achieve a global role, not just economically, but politically as well. Part of this role, of course, is the assumption by Japan of greater responsibility for international security. Given the tragic history of the 30s and 40s, Japan, of course, has to be careful about the way in which she would assume any such additional responsibility. Any attempt by Japan to become, for instance, a regional policeman would plainly prompt a strong and negative reaction, I'm quite sure, Ambassador, from Beijing, but also from other East Asian capitals as well. But even within these constraints, I think Japan can and very much should take a more assertive role internationally. I think it can probably do so best through the UN system, where Japanese peacekeepers have already been involved in efforts and in actions in places like Mozambique and Cambodia. Japan, of course, is going to have to be careful to avoid efforts to exclude the United States economically from East Asia. Talk of a regional trading bloc led by Tokyo does retain a certain fascination in Japan and elsewhere in the region, as I've noticed from time to time as I've traveled in the region since I left office. But such a step would surely be devastating, not just to the U.S.-Japan partnership, but I think to stability in the entire Pacific region. After all, we saw a line drawn down the middle of the Pacific once before in this century with fairly disastrous results. And suggestions by Malaysia that there should be an East Asian caucus without Caucasians is a particularly wrong-headed idea. So the question needs to be asked, how should the United States approach the emergence of Japan as a global power, not just economically, but economically and politically? I think first off, it's obvious that the maintenance of the U.S.-Japan security relationship is of the highest priority. So too, I think, is a general lowering of the rhetoric on trade issues, where patient negotiation, I regret to say, has all too often been replaced by public posturing during recent years. That's going to be hard to do during an election year because, as everyone in this room knows, you can get a standing ovation in any city in this country if you're sufficiently strong in the way you bash Japan. But we need to find a better way. And I think, lastly, the United States should work to ensure that regional economic integration occurs through fora like APEC, which assure that there will be a continued major American economic role in East Asia. Now let me turn to China, where I want to spend most of my time this evening, because China is the emerging great power in the world today, and that's why China occupies a particularly important position in the agenda of our conference. China's rise has been most dramatic, obviously, in the economic realm. The efforts in Beijing to liberalize the Chinese economy have clearly catapulted the country into the front ranks of the world's economy. However, the stupendous growth of the last few years has created not just domestic, but also some foreign imbalances. And the latter, these foreign imbalances, have already begun to strain U.S.-Chinese relations as our trade deficit with China begins to show signs of becoming as intractable and contentious as our imbalance with Japan. But the decisive factor in the future of U.S.-Chinese relations will, I submit to you, be the course of Chinese internal politics. China's transition in the post-Deng era will have vast ramifications not just for China itself, but for the region as a whole. Beijing's two-tracked approach of economic liberalization, combined with political authoritarianism, has yielded remarkable short-term economic results. It remains to be seen, however, whether such an approach is sustainable in the long run. To be blunt with you, history would suggest that it is not. Experience, not just in the West, but in East Asian countries like Korea and Taiwan, clearly indicates that the creation of an educated entrepreneurial class inevitably leads to demands for protection of human rights and greater political participation. So what are the possible scenarios for China's short to medium-term political future? I think there are four. The first scenario is that the much-awaited transition has in fact already occurred, and that the current leadership, whoever its nominal head, will continue to preside over a stable, if authoritarian, China for the foreseeable future. I consider this scenario unlikely, not just because of the age of many of the figures involved, but because of what will certainly be continued pressure within China herself for a more open political system. The second and most likely scenario is a period of calm lasting perhaps 6 months to 2 years as the leading figures of the younger generation share power with members of the current leadership. Then I think the inevitable internal jockeying will begin, and in time I think we will see a peaceful, if initially only partial, transition to a more participatory political system. A third scenario, which I think possible but unlikely, is the emergence of a military dictatorship, prepared to suppress internal discontent even at the cost of international opprobrium and at the cost of foreign investment. Such a regime might resort to foreign adventurism to rally domestic support, a dangerous course made attractive by China's decisive military advantage over most of her neighbors. And finally, there is a fourth, if also fairly unlikely scenario, and that is that a power vacuum in Beijing would lead to a repeat of the tragic civil wars of the 1920s. Economic liberalization has already led to degrees of regional autonomy unheard of in recent Chinese history, a development that is in itself, I think, in no way alarming and perhaps even welcome. However, absent a strong central government, that trend might possibly, again I think this is unlikely, but might possibly accelerate dangerously into outright and violent conflict between competing centers of authority. The ultimate path that China takes, of course, is of intense interest to all of us, to the United States and to all of China's Asian neighbors. Several of the scenarios that I've just sketched would contribute materially to regional and indeed even global instability. China, we should never forget, is Asia's preeminent military power, with some 3 million individuals under arms and with a significant nuclear weapons capability. Given these facts, it is vital that the United States and its allies maintain a military posture that would permit us to counter a possible Chinese bid for regional hegemony, however unlikely, and I think it is unlikely, however unlikely that might be. Only one of China's neighbors by itself possesses the combination of population, technological capacity, and economic might to check any such bid. And that country, of course, is Japan. Yet, for powerful reasons that I've already discussed, Japan today simply cannot play that role. And that means that America's special defense relationships with Japan and South Korea have to remain linchpins of Asian security. And so too must our close military cooperation with the countries of ASEAN. Now, having said all that, let me stress one point. I am absolutely not proposing in any way, shape, or form an American-led alliance against China, because in my view, nothing could be more counterproductive. And I am not suggesting in any way that our policy of engagement with China become one of containment of China. As I said in regard to NATO and Russia, the best way to make an enemy is to look for one. On the contrary, the growing economic links between China and the outside world, particularly the foreign investment that has driven much of China's recent expansion, represent by far the best guarantee that China will be a force for stability in the region. And these links also give China's main economic partners limited but real leverage on such issues as human rights. But maintaining a credible American military presence in the Pacific can also play a role, as it has in the past, in promoting security in East Asia. This is particularly true, I think, with respect to the continuing risk of conflict on the Korean Peninsula, where, sad to say, in my view at least, North Korea's game of nuclear cat and mouse with the international community appears to have paid off. In sum, let me say, the United States and its allies in East Asia plainly have a powerful interest in China's long-term stability. And that stability is best served, in my opinion, by an approach that balances support for greater political freedom in China with continued efforts to deepen China's economic links with the outside world. Now, striking that balance, as we've seen over the last several years, 5 or 6 years, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, is not easy. But it is precisely such balance that is going to be required if those with an interest in China's future are going to help shape it. And this balance, in turn, really does require more discipline and particularly more consistency in American foreign policy towards China. Over the last few years particularly, I think such discipline and consistency have often been sorely missing. The about face on MFN was just one example. A worse one was the decision to grant a visa to President Lee of Taiwan after the State Department had advised Beijing that the visa would not be granted. Now, I think that the decision to grant the visa was clearly the correct decision, substantively, because I think it's important that the United States make it clear that we reserve the right to grant visas for private and unofficial visits. But the frankly amateurish way in which we went about it procedurally was absolutely inexcusable. So we really should ask ourselves, what should be the key elements of American foreign policy towards China? And I want to suggest 6 tonight for your consideration. First of all, I think it is really important that we maintain a consistent policy of constructive engagement with Beijing based on mutual respect and understanding. Secondly, I think we must continue to use the 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act as the basis of American foreign policy, specifically that there is only one China, that Taiwan is part of it, that the United States will support any peaceful resolution of the differences between the People's Republic of China and the people of Taiwan, and that we will have we, the United States, will have broad, unofficial relations with Taiwan. And I think it's important to note that this includes assisting Taiwan to have an adequate defense through arms sales as well as unspecified actions in the event of any attack on Taiwan. Even more importantly, I think we should continue to remember, and we should remind others, that one of the chief purposes of the Taiwan Relations Act was, and I want to quote it because I think it's very important, was, quote, to make clear that the United States' decision to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China rests upon the expectation that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means, close quote. Third, we need to establish and sustain a serious, high-level political dialogue with China to reconcile our differences over trade, over human rights, and over the questions involving proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Above all, we need to avoid the sort of angry public confrontations that can destroy any kind of a dialogue like that. Fourth, I think the administration needs to reach a bipartisan accord with Congress, as we in the Bush administration did in 1989 on Central America, which at the time was the most divisive foreign policy issue that intruded upon our domestic political debate. We need to see if a bipartisan accord can be reached so as to remove China policy from our domestic political debate. It is absolutely vital, given the sensitivities involved and given the importance of the relationship, vital that the American government speak with one voice in our dealings with China. Fifth, we need to encourage the leadership in Beijing and Taipei to concentrate on substance and forget about symbols. We should encourage direct contact between them. The focus should be on areas of mutual advantage, such as cross-straits investment, rather than on areas of intractable difference. My own personal view is that a de jure solution of this problem in the near term is not in the cards. However, I think the problem will ultimately resolve itself as a de facto matter, provided substance is allowed to prevail over symbols. Sixth, we need to avoid the false choices that suggest that American foreign policy must be entirely based either on high principle or on material advantage. In short, exclusively either on idealism or on realism. Because the real world of foreign policy lies somewhere in between, and this is nowhere truer than when it comes to China, where we need to balance, for instance, our clear interest in improving human rights with our no less compelling interest in commercial engagement. So those are the six elements that I think should make up our policy, American foreign policy toward China. Now, in conclusion, let me say that the policy suggestions that I have outlined here this evening, I hope reflect both the complexity of the issues at hand and the importance of the stakes for the United States as East Asia moves into the Pacific century. There are indeed clear limits to American influence in Moscow, in Tokyo, and in Beijing. But I think there are also practical measures by which we can advance American interests through maximizing opportunities and minimizing risks during a period of profound change for each of these three other great Asian powers, Russia, China, and Japan. And finally, let us also bear in mind that the United States, too, is passing through an important historic transition. The end of the Cold War and a pressing domestic agenda have tended to put foreign policy on the back burner of our national political debate. The uncertainties of the new global economy have given a new saliency and, in some cases, a new rancor to international economic issues, and particularly trade issues. And not least, a truly bipartisan approach to foreign policy has been undermined by the stark political divisions in Washington, which in turn are caused in large part by the fact that for all but six of the last 28 years, we have had divided government in the United States of America. In other words, we've had an executive branch controlled by one party and a legislative branch controlled by the other. I know this is a nonpartisan, non-political evening, but we may be able to do something about that this year. Let me say that all of these developments have added strains to our relations with all three of the great Asian powers that I've mentioned. Above all, these developments have tended to erode the sort of American leadership abroad that I think is vital to international stability in general, and certainly to stability in East Asia in specific. But American leadership abroad is impossible without leadership here at home. And that leadership cannot stop with our elected officials. Business people, academics, civic leaders, informed citizens must all be part of our national foreign policy debate on China, on East Asia, on the broader international arena. That, ladies and gentlemen, at a fundamental level, is what this conference is all about. And it is why I, for one, am so proud that the Baker Institute and the Asia Society could help make it possible. Thank you all for coming. God bless you all.
I think we have time for a few questions. Who'd like to take the first? Right there, sir.
Secretary Baker, in your talk you referred to inconsistent policy, and it looks like with MFN coming up for review again this year, we have another opportunity to either have more inconsistent policy or perhaps a move towards a stable and consistent policy. And I'm wondering if you can give us some insight on how the current administration and or Congress might act in order to have a policy that kind of leads us more towards our long-term goals.
Well, you know, the Bush administration was strongly supportive of maintaining MFN for China. Our view was we should not try to isolate China, that we should not, in effect, cut off our nose to spite our face. And so we renewed it annually as it came up, and the Democratic Congress every year passed a resolution to cut off MFN because we were not doing enough to improve human rights in China, and President Bush would veto those resolutions every year, and then we'd have to work, Janet Mullins, who's here tonight, and I and others in the State Department would have to work very hard to cobble together enough votes to sustain the president's veto every year. That's what I'm talking about when I say we ought to try and take China policy out of the domestic political debate, if it's possible. Now, the current administration came into office with a policy heavily oriented towards human rights. They've done an about-face, they've done a 180 in effect, and they're pursuing the same policy, I think, that the Bush administration had, particularly when it comes to maintaining MFN for China. I think that's a right policy, and I hope they continue to pursue it. And I hope that they're able to maintain that policy against legislative efforts to cut it off, because I think it's a right policy. We thought it was a right policy then. It wasn't the politically popular policy. We pursued it because it was the right policy. It's still the right policy.
Yeah, there, sir. Get away from me. Just one question.
You the boss. You the boss.
When you were speaking of the substance versus the symbols, could you give us a specific example of what you meant by when you're focusing on, when you want us to focus more on the substance rather than the symbols?
Yeah, there's a lot going on across the straits. There's a lot of investment. There's a lot of visiting of families and so forth. There's a lot of commercial activity that's taking place across the straits. The problem was getting better and better. It was beginning to, in effect, solve itself in a practical way, in a de facto manner, and not in a de jure manner. And therefore, I think it's really important that it's those cross-straits types of contacts and things that be concentrated on. The initiation of discussions regarding trade between Taiwan and the PRC, agreements having to do with economic agreements that had been beginning to be discussed, rather than issues, rather than other more contentious issues of a higher political profile. Let me tell you what I mean. When we started APEC, shortly thereafter, we were confronted with the question of how we could work it out so that both China and Taiwan could have a seat at the table, two huge economies in Asia. And we came up with the rather creative formula, I think, that we would talk about each of them as economies. And the United States was an economy. We weren't talking about countries, we were talking about economies. That made it possible for the PRC and Taiwan to sit across the table from each other. They're both members in good standing of APEC. Those kinds of things move us in the right direction, but insisting upon high-level political symbols move us in the opposite direction.
Secretary Baker, first, can you kindly comment on the suggestion of Vice Minister Sun that one of the ways that we can reduce the trade deficit between U.S. and China is the exportation of American judges and lawyers?
Minister, you mean you want them exported out of China or into China?
Question is that
Let me just answer the first one. Let me tell you, as a lawyer, I can say this because I'm a lawyer. You won't get a lot of argument here in the United States if you're talking about exporting lawyers abroad. There'll be a lot of people who would support that.
And Secretary Baker, another question is that right now, in terms of deployment of forces, there are U.S. Military ground forces and air forward stationed both in key theaters of Western Europe as well as in North Asia. But after the closure of the base in the Philippines, there's no other than naval deployment of U.S. in the region. As the U.S. continue to be engaged in the Southeast Asia Pacific region, do you foresee there's a time in which there's a necessary for deployment of American either air bases or land forces in continental Asia?
Well, we have substantial forces in South Korea. We have substantial forces in Japan, all of which are in East Asia, of course. We have some rights with Singapore, some arrangements with Singapore. And I think we didn't want to lose the bases in the Philippines, but the Philippines didn't want us there. One thing about the United States that I used to say all the time is we never want to be where we're not wanted. We've never wanted to go out and take anybody's territory, and we've never, that's one reason I think the United States is a force for stability around the world. I remember, a little bit off the point, but I remember when we were talking to Gorbachev about German unification. And he looked at me and he said, I certainly hope that you Americans are going to maintain your troop presence in Europe. This is the president of the Soviet Union telling the American Secretary of State he wants American troops to remain in Europe. So I think that most people see that we are a force for stability. We don't have any designs on territory. And I think we will definitely continue to maintain a credible presence in the Pacific, as I indicated in my remarks.
Time for one more question.
There's recently been a lot of press about the trade tensions and Chinese perhaps flagrantly violating some of the trade agreements with the U.S. Many people would say it's time to penalize them, especially politicians in an electoral year. What are your views on the prospects of this trade rhetoric getting out of hand this year, and what do you think the proper way is to deal with some of these trade allegations and problems?
Well, I think, as I indicated in my remarks, that you sometimes accomplish a lot more through quiet negotiation, quiet and patient negotiation, than you do when you pound the table and make a big public issue out of something. But I do think that there's a problem. And again, as I indicated in my remarks, I think it would be very, very damaging to the overall U.S.-China relationship if the imbalances that appear to be building up would look like they were going to become structural and be maintained for any significant period of time. They've certainly been a terrible irritant in our relationship with our very, very close ally with whom we have a security treaty, Japan. And we need to nip this in the bud. We simply cannot abide a situation where the deficit year after year after year continues to grow in the way in which it's grown in the last few years. So we need to continue to insist that China maintain open markets and play by the rules of the game.
Secretary, thank you very much.
Mr. Secretary, as Nick Platt said, thank you very much for those incisive and thought-provoking remarks. It's a fit for an appropriate way to conclude this evening. And I know tomorrow we'll have just as stimulating a discussion on the issues as we've had today. And this is a reminder that the program starts at 7:30, Continental Breakfast, and 8 o'clock, our first keynote speaker. So this concludes our evening. Thank you very much.